So it's been about a week since President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposed harsh sanctions against Iran, although with a 180-day period in which it will be implemented. In other words, you have the hardest U.S. exit or Trexit or whatever you want to call it you could have. So this deal has been utterly repudiated on the American side, and we're going to look at all the implications of that. And let's begin by thinking about why did this happen? And I think it's very hard not to believe that what Mr. Trump was doing had a great deal to do with the extent to which the JCPOA was the signature achievement of the second Obama administration. He ran against this. He ran against everything that Obama ever did, and he plainly wanted to blow this up. As far as everyone can tell, he made a great deal of progress with the Europeans on missile development, on regional affairs, etc., and they got caught up in over sunsets, over when the restrictions on Iran would expire, and couldn't really agree. Essentially, as I understand it, Washington was asking the Europeans to commit to virtually total sanctions on Iran if they ever got a year away from breakout, which is where they were at the beginning of this process. And I think the administration might have had a case if the Europeans had been more adamant on this, and if they wanted to focus on, at the end of the process, that Iran would have been only 4 months away from breakout. But it's very hard to justify, in my view, on its own terms. And so I guess the question I would ask both of you is, what does this mean now? I mean, where is this going, especially in the region?
Well, I think it's hard to avoid the fact that this is going to lead at least to a greater potential for confrontation. We've already seen that, actually, with the escalation between Hezbollah and their forces, or Iranian forces acting in Syria and Israel. And I think basically with the withdrawal from the JCPOA, we've kind of removed the carrot towards Iran, this way of engagement with Iran, and we're very clearly then looking towards a strategy of rolling back Iran's influence in the region. And that's a strategy that's being supported both by the Trump administration, most notably from the National Security Council, and their new appointee, John Bolton, who's long believed that Iran's influence is a malign influence in the region, and that we need to take it much more directly to Iran, both in these kind of proxy areas where we've already seen conflicts emerging in Syria and Yemen, but also potentially to Iran itself. And I think there's some support of that within the Gulf states, particularly within Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which also have been very uncomfortable with Iran's expanding influence in the region.
Yeah, I'd be a lot less worried about this than I am if I thought there was a viable plan B. But as far as I can tell, the only plan B out there is some frankly unbaked, not even half-baked, but unbaked ideas about regime change. And I'd just like to say that there's no example in human history of an externally imposed regime change without an invasion and occupation. So maybe they're trying to create, a polka-dotted unicorn, but we know that those simply don't exist. So if there's anything beyond that, anything more detailed, we don't know what it might be. I would be perfectly interested in hearing about a serious plan to work with the other powers in the Middle East to do something about Iran's behavior and something about maybe having a better government in Tehran. But I don't see how the reimposition of sanctions gets you there at all. What do you think about the implications of this move?
Yeah, well, I think you've just described what's really a one-dimensional approach. With the U.S. withdrawal of the agreement has created some real winners and losers, which I don't know that the U.S. or the Trump administration really foresaw or thought carefully about. I mean, on the one hand, so we have the reimposition of some sanctions beginning in August, and that'll be on cars and automotive parts. This hurts a couple of French companies very, very badly. And then in November, we'll see the reimposition of sanctions against the energy sector in Iran. And this, of course, will hurt Iran, but maybe not. There's some disagreement over how much, because Iran can continue to export its oil because its number 1 and 2 purchasers are China and India. And there would be ways for China and India to continue purchasing Iranian oil and not really engage the sanctions at all, because if they can purchase in local currency, they avoid the US dollar, they avoid US financial institutions. And so there's some disagreement of how much of an impact will this have on Iran's ability to export. It creates, like, of the 3.5 billion barrels a day that they produce, we're looking at 200,000 to maybe 500,000 barrels a day that will be off the market.
Yeah. Is there any chance that the Europeans, the E3, will find a way to trade with Iran that gets around U.S. sanctions against the Central Bank of Iran, or if the SWIFT code is again not allowed? Can they do that?
This is tough. This is why we really have, I think, done a disservice to our transatlantic partnership. I mean, we've really put the Europeans in a tough position. And it's not that there is so much trade between Iran and the European Union, but it had been increasing. There can be the blocking resolution, which would continue to allow, especially some small European businesses which don't have either a U.S. Head of the company or majority U.S. ownership. But it's, in the end, the U.S. for the last 2 years never really fully was 100% into the JCPOA because of our banking restrictions on transactions with Iran.
We'll come back to the global tally in a second, but coming back to the region, could you tell us a bit about the reactions of GCC countries and societies and what the range of opinion there is? Because obviously it is somewhat mixed.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that there is really a variety of opinion, even within the Gulf states, on this withdrawal from the agreement. We definitely have hardliners, mostly in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, which came out immediately in support of the withdrawal of the agreement. And I think they're the ones who have been most concerned about Iranian expansionism in the region and have some appetite for pushing back against that. But there are the other states in the region, notably Oman, Kuwait, and as well Qatar, who have, for strategic reasons, that have to do with both geopolitics and have to do with economics, have really positioned themselves more as mediators, wanting to kind of balance a little bit against the rising power in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and to keep some good ties with Iran. We can see this with Oman often being kind of a spokesman for greater engagement and even eventual integration of Iran in the region, while Kuwait has recently been positioning itself as sort of a leader in the northern Gulf and would like to see increased trade with both Iraq and with Iran. And so I think this makes things more difficult. As well for Dubai, we could talk about Dubai within the UAE. We even have differences of opinion within Gulf states who, with Dubai having a lot of trade with Iran, may also not be as comfortable with this approach, a more confrontational approach.
Sorry, the boycott gives also the Qataris a slightly different view of this.
Right,
as well,
and you can probably talk about that and why you think that could also do for both regions.
I think it speaks for itself. But I'd like to go now from I'd like to widen the aperture a little bit. And so the biggest, globally, the biggest winner here you think is China. Can you quickly tell us why you think that's the case?
Yeah, so the Chinese can continue buying Iranian oil. They have a lot of investment inside of Iran, including for the Belt Road Initiative. They've built subways, railroads, regular roads, enormous increase in investment just since the middle of 2017. The advantage is China benefits from the U.S. security umbrella in the Persian Gulf and in the Strait of Hormuz in particular, because most of the energy that is exported from all of the Gulf states, not just Iran, but also coming from Saudi Arabia, coming from Abu Dhabi, is going to China. And so they can have the best of both worlds, essentially.
Win-win. Yeah, absolutely. So now, the countries that you mentioned that did welcome this, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, fairly quickly and fairly enthusiastically, are clearly hoping for a new initiative to roll back Iran, as you said. But you'd have to imagine the epicenter of that, even though Saudi Arabia might be more interested in Yemen, what's relevant now mainly is in Syria. But Trump deliberately avoided any Iran or Hezbollah, not to mention Russia targets, when he struck Syria, and he wanted to pull all the troops out right away and had to be dissuaded from that. So, to me, there are these incredibly mixed messages. He's been very tough in words on TV and seems to want nothing to do with any regional conflicts to roll back Iran in practice. What do you think?
I'd agree with you that, like you said, that there's no plan B, that really when you talk about in practice how you roll back Iranian influence in Syria and in Yemen, you kind of have to get down into the weeds and show some willingness to show that confrontation. But I do think it sort of increases this logic of confrontation by opening the door to other actors who might want to do that, including Israel. And at least we'll have to see. I mean, I imagine with the kind of the team that the Trump administration is putting together, there'll at least be some within that team that really would like to push for a much stronger rollback strategy.
No doubt.
And I think there's going to be kind of just as the tension increases on Iran, there's going to be much more kind of potential for misunderstandings, for reactions that can increase kind of a situation that could draw the U.S. much more into even a war setting with Iran.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, look, the logic of this, insofar as there is one, pushes towards regime change. If you don't want to deal with Iran, and you really want to rip up the treaty, then you're really looking for regime change. The problem is we know that nothing that's on the table right now can even get you even closer to regime change in reality, let alone achieve it. So my final thought here is that this is another instance of the absolute triumph of domestic politics over foreign policy. It's there in the Jerusalem embassy move. It's here in the ripping up of the JCPOA. And time and again, we see this is an administration that has taken the privileging of domestic politics over foreign policy to the ultimate level. Anyway, that's my closing thought.
And forgetting who its friends are.
Yeah, well, it's not an issue.
And forgetting to punish its enemies.
America first, and do what you want. Anyway, thanks very much. This has been great. We'll do it again very soon.